The opening cinematic to the first Dark Souls is one of the most entrancing introductions to any game, giving you the foundational lore of the world, yet whetting your appetite for more. I remember that when I first played the game in 2011, it was the three lords in particular that fascinated me. Gwyn, Izalith, and of course, Nito. Nito in particular had a very striking design, and I remember thinking to myself, I really hope we get to fight this guy. And we did. Yet upon my first playthrough, I found his story was lacking when compared to the Witch of Izalith and Gwyn, or at the very least he was given less lore, and I believe this was a common sentiment at the time. However, that was over 10 years ago, and since then we've had many years to scrutinise every word, every brick of the catacombs, and of course we've had a couple of sequels, one of which added some interesting lore in regards to his legacy. In a game series that is ruled by the concept of undeath, arguably there is no greater fundamental lore point to understand than the nature of real death. So in this lore video we are going to do a deepest dive as possible on Nito and death throughout the Dark Souls story, looking at his origins, the nature of death, his relationship to the other gods, and his relationship to the dark. By integrating the work of Lokey's Abyssal Archive, we will also look at the semantics of the Japanese script for a deeper understanding. I do want to make it clear at the onset of this video that a lot of my work here draws upon and is inspired by the work of Lokey's book. I work with Lokey a lot and I have his blessings to make this video. But before we go any further guys, remember that if you like Souls lore, then consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. But before we dive into the Tomb of the Giants, we have a word from today's sponsor, Raycon, a match made in heaven for Smalltown viewers, and the perfect Valentine's Day gift. With Valentine's Day approaching, it is time to reflect on what you love, and I am in love with my Raycon Everyday earbuds, and I genuinely take them everywhere. When I'm getting a train, going to the shop, or the gym, it's the best way to listen to my Age of Empires 2 coaching videos. They are so comfortable with their optimised gel tips for the perfect fit, and best of all is the convenient charge pod, meaning when I'm done I just pop them back in and put it in my pocket, no matter where I am. It's so convenient. And they get charged in their carry case as well. I've owned my Raycon since November and I use them almost every day, and I've only had to charge the charge pod itself once in that time. Like any serious love story, Raycon is here for a good time and a long time, with 8 hours of playtime and 32-hour battery life. Best of all, Raycon is half the price of premium audio, with tens of thousands of 5-star reviews on the everyday earbuds. So click on the link in the description box or go to buyraycon.com/smalltown to get 15% off your Raycon purchase, plus free shipping. Thanks again to Raycon for sponsoring this video, and now back to the lore. As we often seem to do in this Dark Souls lore series, we need to go back to the beginning to understand Nito's origins, back to the transition between the Age of Ancients and the Age of Fire. The introduction to the game itself tells us that the fire brought with it light and dark, as well as life and death. Prior to this, neither life nor death existed, as the dragons of the Age of Ancients were essentially perpetual minerals, things that weren't alive and didn't die, they just existed. There was no change, there was no life, there was no evolution, and of course, there was no death. Until fire came. Of course, we have to discuss Nito's honorific title when trying to understand his position as a lord, and his relation to death. Nito is the first of the dead, of course bringing us the two classic interpretations of this title. One, that he is the first among the dead, i.e. the leader of the dead, and two, he is the first dead being ever. Personally, I've always thought of it as a sort of double entendre, that he is the first being to die and as a result he is the leader of the dead. Lokey provides some clarity on this discussion by translating the original Japanese, confirming that the first of the dead in relation to Nito is in terms of sequence, and I quote Lokey now. Nito, the first of the dead. Fans often debate the meaning of first, but this is the wrong question to ask. First quite explicitly refers to the sequence, not position. He is the start of the dead in the same way that the first flame is the beginning of fire. Lokey instead believes the real question that we should be asking is, what does death mean in the world of Dark Souls? And we will return to that shortly. But for now, let us focus on the origins of Nito, as we now can confirm that he was the first being that was dead in the world of Dark Souls. Of course, like the other lords, as described in the opening cinematic, Nito must have discovered his Lord Soul within the flames, thus taking the power of the Death Soul and becoming the first dead. The fact that he is the first dead in regards to sequence is also evident without the surety of translation. For example, if we look at the item description of the Gravelord Sword Dance, which reads the following: "Miracle known only by the servants of the first dead, Gravelord Nito." Seeing Nito as the first being to ever die at the onset of the Age of Fire, to me makes him one of the most primeval beings in existence. Nito is the personification of death and disease, facets and concepts that have defined humanity long before civilization and order took hold in our real world. Where Gwyn represents civilization and order, concepts that come much later in the history of human development, Nito's realm is a factor that unites all forms of life, no matter their level of sentience and development. Thus, thematically for me, I've always seen Nito as one of the first of the lords. Now, obviously I have no real reason to believe that he's the first of the lords apart from my own speculation, beyond the thematic reasons I have just alluded to. His domain may well be further evidence of Nito's association with early life. It is named Tomb of the Giants, and indeed most of it seems to have been designed for the entombment of giants, and is of course populated almost exclusively by the animated giant skeletons. In terms of architectural stratigraphy, the Tomb of the Giants is one of the deepest locations in the game, and given its proximity to the Ash Lake, the world where life came from according to the opening cinematic, the Tomb of the Giants very much could have been one of the first migration points for the life that evolved from fire, moving upwards to the upper levels above the canopy of Ash Lake, possibly one of the first locations that the giant race settled. There is something ancient, classical and primordial about the architecture in the Tomb of the Giants, compared to the catacombs above, and of course later Anor Londo. Lokey suggests that the catacombs were indeed built for a separate purpose, an extension that came later attached to the Tomb of the Giants. It was for the purpose of entombing the human followers of Anor Londo, and I quote Lokey now. He settles in the giant graveyard, but the catacombs are built practically on top of it. This underground graveyard is much more organised and clearly designed for human burials. The only human civilizations in its immediate vicinity are the Undead Burg and New Londo, but both are populated by undead, and there is already a traditional graveyard behind Firelink Shrine. So who was this middle layer of interment history for? We can confirm the identity of one person entombed there by the Dark Moon Seance ring on his person. It is actually a Dark Moon priest ring, and implies that a priest to Gwendolyn was laid to rest there, not general adherents. This ties the use of the catacombs to the god of Anor Londo. I certainly agree with Lokey in the sense that these catacombs are clearly a later construction compared to the Tomb of the Giants. The architecture is clearly more modern, and as Lokey says, it is far more organised than the kind of burial pit that the Tomb of the Giants is. And thus the catacombs are a later extension that are joined on to the Tomb of the Giants, as a later extension of his realm. And in my personal opinion, I believe Nito was a part of the giant race, a race that predated humanity and even the race of gods that Gwyn and the Witch of Izalith belonged to. His form itself seems to align with the race of the giants more. Thanks to the content creator crest, we can see what Nito looks like after he has been stripped of his rags and other minor skeletons. What remains underneath as the backbone of his form is the remains of a giant, very similar in appearance to other skeletal giants. Just as a quick aside, this is my opinion. I believe Lokey disagrees on this point, thinking that Nito belongs to the race of medios that Gwyn and Izalith belong to, and that this body is a construct of his necromantic abilities. One of the other types of giant skeletons that is of great interest in the Tomb of the Giants, when trying to analyse early non-dragon life, is the quadruped variants that we fight as well, the beast skeletons, if you will. In my last Dark Souls video on the dragons, which I will link below, I shared a theory of Lokey's from his Abyssal Archive, in which we discussed the possibility that all life came from the dragons, and there is certainly a good bit of logic to this, as in the Age of Ancients there was only the everlasting dragons. With the onset of life, death, disparity, and the flame, the ancient dragons themselves became afflicted with the curse of life, and in time would devolve into their lesser drake kin, like the drakes we find in the Valley of the Drakes, for example, or the wyvern that we meet in Dark Souls 3. In regards to humanity and the giants, Lokey's suggestion is that the giants and later humanity were just a derivative offshoot devolved from the dragons, over generations, over millennia. To reinforce this idea, Lokey examines these skeletons that we can find in the environment of the Tomb of the Giants. These skeletons are a little different from the giant skeletons that we face. They are more serpentine in appearance, and I will now quote Lokey on his analysis of them. Littered across the tomb is a third type of skeleton unlike the other two. While still retaining a humanoid element, the skull's pronounced jaw has become a snout. The teeth have become a set of sharp fangs, and the cranial area has become slightly elongated. The body has 4 limbs, ending in claws instead of fingers and toes. The beast skeleton is the ancestral link between the modern giants and these serpentine humanoids, which seem to have gone extinct as the giant lineage evolved into present bipedal form. The giants as we know them seem to have evolved from a serpentine ancestor, likely tracing their lineage to actual serpents, and thereby dragons. Whether or not you agree with this, that humans and giants are an offshoot of dragon kind, I think the majority of people will still see some significance in the quadruped variants, with their sharpened fangs and posture. It is hard not to see these skeletons as that of primates, again reinforcing the idea that this tomb houses the early ancestors of humanity, speaking to the sheer age of Nito's domain. There is a common trope in fantasy and myth that giants are often portrayed as those who came before. They are always larger and somewhat more primitive, and it is easy to equate Dark Souls giants with this idea. For example, in Norse mythology, the giants are the predecessors to the gods, and the very first giant, Ymir, arose from the primordial chaos of the universe. Likewise, in Greek mythology, the giants or titans represented barbarism and primitive culture, whereas the Olympians that came after represented civilization. I think it's fair to say that a lot of Gwyn is definitely based on Zeus, and one could definitely equate High Anor Londo with Olympus. And therefore, following this analogy down to the giants in Dark Souls, they do also seem to follow this tradition, with the majority of giants now being enslaved by the gods, represented as crude and simplistic, with the giant blacksmith almost possessing a childlike manner. Of course, Hawkeye Gold shows us that there is a keen intelligence to some among their number, yet his imprisonment is still an oblique reference to their kind being excluded from modern civilization, and the new gods taking over from the giants. With all that said, Nito's journey to become the first of the dead clearly started with his claiming of his Lord Soul. So let's read the item description for his soul now. Soul of Gravelord Nito, first of the dead. The Lord Soul was discovered at the dawn of the Age of Fire. Gravelord Nito administers the death of all manner of beings. The power of his soul is so great that it satiates the Lord Vessel, despite the fact that much of its energy has already been offered to death. So the most interesting thing about this item description, to me, is where it says much of its energy has already been offered to death, of course underlining the fact that Nito's power over death flows directly from his Lord Soul, from the flame itself. For now, let us just accept that Nito was indeed the first to become dead in that specific Dark Souls way, which we will address later. But how was he the first dead? Did he die before any other being, and thus claim the Lord Soul in death? Or did he claim the Lord Soul and therefore become dead after the power of death was imbued within him? My assumption has always been that Nito claimed the soul and then became dead. He claimed the Lord Soul at the dawn of the Age of Fire. Death and Nito are one and the same. As long as there has been death, there has been Nito. Upon claiming this soul, he became Nito that we know now, a Lord of Death, and it was him who would start to administer death in this world. That is just my assumption, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Of course, now there's the inherent difficulty of understanding the differences between death and the curse of the undead, given the necromantic nature of Nito's realm and servants. Because to the uninitiated, it may well seem like there's little difference between the curse of the undead brought on by the dark sign and the skeletons and spirits of Nito's realm. Again, this is an aspect that Lokey is great at dissecting, due to his keen understanding of the soul, life, and death within Dark Souls. Throughout his book, Lokey reminds the reader of the fact that souls were found within the flame, and they are the key element that is the source of life in this new age of fire. In the Ancient Dragons video, which again I'd recommend you watch, we discuss how it was the advent of souls that corrupted the ancient dragons, transforming them from a mineral, non-living being into a living race that would eventually devolve and become the drakes that we know now. Once again, I quote Lokey from Abyssal Archive, as I find this to be a rather important passage in understanding the nature of death and the soul. He writes the following: "All living things age until death finally claims them, at which point their living bodies, disconnected from even their souls, further atrophy. Even immortal dragons aren't immune to this phenomena. The power of rock simply prevents it from occurring naturally while the base souls are still tied to the non-living bodies. Ultimately, death affects everything touched by the soul. Death can be best described as decay, the inevitable entropy of the universe, when the power of fire runs its course to its natural conclusion. And yet the reanimated dead are in a sense alive. Nito's miasma of death still affects the skeletons fighting alongside him, and slaying them provides souls just like living beings. Miyazaki distinguished the archdragons from life due to their being half-living and half-element. We can apply this same framing to the dead, who possess living souls but expired bodies. For me, the key takeaway from this passage and Lokey's analysis is that the soul and the body are two separate things. That while the soul is the source of all life and disparity, it can persist when its original frame has expired. And this is why the reanimated skeletons are essentially expired bodies that have had a soul transplanted into them by Nito's necromantic arts. He is able to use his necromancy to use souls to animate dead bodies, in a manner that doesn't feel too different from the golems of Drangleic. So these beings are dead in the sense that their living tissue has long since atrophied, but they are still powered by souls. And this is the core aspect of Nito's necromantic miracles. It's important to understand this definition of death and souls, of living matter and dead, as I believe it very much comes into play when we try to examine the undead crypt of Dark Souls 2 and its purpose, in the latter part of this video. With that said, we now turn to the powers of Nito, his followers, and his relationship with the other gods. It is probably important that we discuss the way in which Nito administers this death. We of course get a taste of it in the opening cinematic of the game, where Nito unleashes his miasma of death and disease to waste away the bodies of the dragons. Just as an aside, this of course has interesting implications for the nature of the dragons at this point in history, for surely if they were still completely mineral like the ancient dragons of the Age of Ancients, Nito's powers would simply have no effect on them. This reinforces Lokey's theory that we discussed in my dragons video, that the ancient dragons were transformed by the coming of the fire as much as every other type of life, that they became sort of half-living and eventually over time would devolve into other species. Lokey touched on it earlier, but I agree that the power of death within the world of Dark Souls is essentially the power of atrophy, anything that wastes away the living. The four main powers that come into existence in the Age of Fire with the Flame are light and dark, life and death, and so it makes sense that in a world that is now full of living beings, there would need to be some death. So it makes sense that Nito would need to spread his power of death throughout the world, administering it, so that natural death may counteract and balance out life. One way in which he does this is via his Gravelord Servant Covenant, a group of followers bound to Nito by contract, who spread death on behalf of their lord. We know from the Gravelord Sword Dance that Nito expects his Gravelord servants to spread death in his name, using the Eyes of Death. We learn a little of this process via the item descriptions of the eyes themselves, which read the following: "The dreadful Eyes of Death spread disaster across neighbouring worlds. Phantoms lured to the host world may end up as victims, allowing the Eyes of Death to multiply and leading to further proliferation of Bane." So these Eyes of Death are artifacts that are able to spread death across neighbouring worlds. Now, the concept of multiple worlds is a subject we discussed in detail in my Dark Souls time video, and I would highly recommend that you check that out. However, in short, the idea of multiple worlds in Dark Souls is less like parallel worlds or a multiverse, and more a result of stagnating time in Lordran specifically, or more specifically in the region where the First Flame is located, Drangleic in Dark Souls 2 and Lothric in Dark Souls 3. The description of the White Soapstone from Dark Souls 1, the item through which you can engage in jolly cooperation, tells us that in Lordran, the flow of time is distorted, meaning it is localized to this specific region. Indeed, the dialogue from Solaire himself reinforces the idea that this is a localized phenomena to Lordran, as he says,
"We are amidst strange beings in a strange land. The flow of time itself is convoluted, with heroes centuries old phasing in and out. The very fabric wavers, and relations shift and obscure. There's no telling how much longer your world and mine will remain in contact. But use this to summon one another as spirits, cross the gaps between the worlds, and engage in jolly cooperation."
So it's a fair assumption, like everything else in Dark Souls, that this phenomena is caused by the fading flame. We are in its localized eye of the storm, a bubble in which things aren't working properly. Solaire's dialogue where he says that time is convoluted is more correctly translated to stagnant. The Age of Ancients before Disparity came was a time of everlasting dragons. It was a state of perpetual non-life. There was no change, no evolution, and no sequence. Lokey describes the Age of Fire as a time when there was sequence and consequence, and to me that makes perfect sense when there is such a phenomena as life. Things change, there is a sequence of events, the Age of Fire happens and then it begins to fade. This means there is time, it's not perpetual like the Age of Ancients. Thus, if fire brought time, it makes sense that when the fire fades, time too begins to break down. And that's what's happening in Lordran. Time isn't convoluted, more like it's stagnating in a pool of water. There's no longer a linearity to it. And so, undead, who are travelling through Lordran, all of a sudden get separated into different time streams, resulting in bizarre events where we can summon Black Iron Tarkus to our world, and yet 2 minutes later we find his body in Anor Londo. He's clearly been dead for a long time, and yet because of the state of time within Lordran, we are still able to summon him into our time stream. Again, credit to Lokey for this theory, and again I would highly recommend you watch my time video if you want more of an explanation. So with the understanding that there are multiple times coexisting in Lordran at this time, we can return to the Eyes of Death. And so if we follow the logic regarding neighbouring worlds, these eyes seem to take advantage of the fading flame state, their effects crossing across the multiple stagnant timelines present within Lordran, an extremely efficient way to spread death and bane. This also means to me that this has only really been a practice of the Gravelord Covenant since the fading of the flame. This all seems to make sense, given Nito's current position. He is a god who has suffered numerous setbacks, the weakening of his power over time as described by his own soul as he's offered a lot of it to death, the fading of the flame which his power is also tied to, and then there are the 2 attempts on stealing his power, the cultist described in the effigy shield, which was likely not successful, but then there is the betrayal by the Pinwheel, who stole a portion of Nito's power. Never mind the fact that a god of death is likely to see his influence wane in an era that is plagued by the curse of the undead. So it makes perfect sense that Nito would look to take advantage of the strengths of the undead by using them and turning him to his advantage to spread death on his behalf. It's almost certain that the Nito we face in battle in the Tomb of the Giants in our time is a pale imitation of the power he held at his peak. No doubt he would have had the ability to reduce our physical form in seconds with a wave of death, at the peak of his powers as we see him in the opening cinematic. I do really like these lore details in regards to Nito, as surely the Lord of Death at his peak would have been unbeatable, and it makes sense that the lore goes out its way to explain why Nito is far weakened by the time that we are able to finish him off. The same kind of case with Gwyn after all. However, in the early Age of Fire, we can imagine that Nito was an immensely powerful being, who would have carved out his domain in the Tomb of the Giants. In due time, the other lords would also claim their lands, the Witch of Izalith and Gwyn of Anor Londo, both developing their civilizations over a large period of time. Presumably, at some stage, Gwyn would have approached Nito in order to seal a pact to eradicate the dragons and rule the world as a triumvirate. Nito clearly agreed, using his immense power over death to waste away the now semi-living bodies of the ancient dragons, whilst Gwyn's army of Silver Knights and human ringed knights likely did the heavy lifting. With the dragons eliminated, Nito was free to rule over his domain of the dead, while Gwyn ruled from the heights of Anor Londo, much like Hades and Zeus of the old Greek pantheon. Lokey has some interesting ideas regarding Gwyn and Nito's arrangement, trying to dissect the terms of this pact by examining the type of dead that Nito watched over. Lokey notes that in both the Tomb of the Giants and the Catacombs, there are only human burials or giant burials. There are no tombs that seem to fit the size of the medials, the name that Lokey gives to the race that the gods belong to, beyond 2 sarcophagus found in Nito's arena. Aside from that, they're all giant or all human. I quote Lokey now. Gwyn most likely struck a deal with Nito, granting the Gravelord absolute authority over the dead, and permission to spread death to any of the living he chose except for medials. Living is a weakness even for the gods. By striking this deal, the gods of Anor Londo and Witches of Izalith could coexist with the Gravelord without fear of him bringing them under his purview. There is definitely weight to the idea that Gwyn may have feared the power of Nito. When we look at the effigy shield later, you will see its item description describes an event where cultists went into Nito's domain hoping to steal his power so they could use it against the gods specifically, suggesting that the gods could indeed be affected by Nito's death powers. We've also discussed Lokey's belief that the catacombs were a later extension of the Tomb of the Giants, made to house the human followers of the gods of Anor Londo, and it would make sense that this construction would take place during the formalization of this deal. And like the gods he was now in cahoots with, Gravelord Nito would cultivate his followers. In the last chapter of this video, we will discuss the legacy of Nito in Dark Souls 2, and this includes 2 groups of followers of Nito, the Malfinito and the Finito, clearly developed by Nito during his reign as the Gravelord, just unseen in the events of Dark Souls 1. More pertinent for the first game's story is the group of priests known as the Pinwheels. When discussing the nature of these Pinwheel necromancers, Lokey makes an analogous comparison between Nito and Gwyn, between necromancy and the miracles of Gwyn. He begins this discussion by talking about the Pinwheels, plural. The one we fight most prominently in the Catacombs is merely a traitor, one of a greater order. We find a far larger contingent of them outside Nito's boss room, again reinforcing the fact this is an order, not one individual. Unlike the selfish Pinwheel of the Catacombs, these Pinwheels clearly are defending the Lord of Death, right outside his boss room. Lokey believes these are essentially Nito's priests of his order, and I quote Lokey now. The gods commonly have priests learning their magic and serving their will. If these Pinwheels are Nito's priests, then necromancy is just the art passed on by the Gravelord himself. Nito dedicates his Lord Soul's power to spreading death to the living. Thus he found the Death Soul. And so, just like how the discovery and development of holy magic stem from the study of Gwyn's Light Soul, necromancy must be an art stemming from Nito studying the power of his Death Soul. Nito thus found the Death Soul and began to use its power not only to spread death, but to control it, manipulating the souls of the dead to create his undead servants, as well as his own construct body. The Pinwheels themselves are of course well known to be constructs themselves. As Lokey reminds us, the Japanese name for this character is Three-Coat Man, a reference to the two-man coat comedy act, highly suggesting that this character is 3 people combined together, meaning it is likely an undead construct as well, 3 bodies fused together via necromancy. And so with the dragons defeated, his pact secured with the other gods, Nito would reign over his domain of death, only to be interrupted by other events, the cultists' heist, Pinwheel's betrayal, and the rise of the undead. Let us start with the attack on Nito's domain as described by the effigy shield, which reads the following. In an ill-fated plot to destroy the gods, the followers of the occult once attempted to steal the power of Gravelord Nito, the first of the dead. This is of course interesting because we get further hints of discontent at the rule of the gods. In a hidden room of Anor Londo itself, there is an occult club alongside Havel's armour, suggesting that either Havel himself or one of his followers was involved in a conspiracy against the gods. Whether these two groups are linked is unknown, but what is clear is that those who entered the Tomb of the Giants believed that the Gravelord's power over death could be turned against the gods themselves. This is extremely interesting, suggesting that even the gods could have been afflicted with the power of death, as we mentioned earlier. And while the followers of the occult are clearly more aligned with the dark, it seems as though they were trying to use any tool they could against the gods. Whatever the reasoning behind it, the term ill-fated tells us all we need to know about the outcome of this plot. The effigy shield itself is found on a corpse, and it is likely that all members of this expedition befell a similar fate, killed by the Gravelord or his servants in the dark of the Tomb of the Giants. We learn so little about this event, only one line essentially from one item, but it really gets the imagination going. These occultists breaking in to the Tomb of the Giants trying to steal the power of the Gravelord itself. However, while the Gravelord defended his power in this instance, Pinwheel the traitor later succeeds, as we learn of via any of the dropped Pinwheel masks. For example, the Mask of the Father reads the following. One of the three masks of the Pinwheel, the necromancer who stole the power of the Gravelord and reigns over the catacombs. This mask belonged to the Valiant Father. The power that this Pinwheel stole? Well, it has to be the key item that he drops, the Rite of Kindling, an artifact that is of great interest to the Way of White also. This is fascinating, for if we are correct in assuming that the Rite of Kindling is indeed the power of the Gravelord that was stolen by Pinwheel, then this means that Nito developed the Rite of Kindling, a tool meant to hamper the progress of the dark. It's an interesting idea to ponder, as one may initially associate it closer with the Way of White and their objectives, which it is, given their focus on claiming it via expeditions, and how it lines up with the gods' objectives of manipulating and sacrificing the undead. Yet, as we have already discussed, Nito had a somewhat of an alliance with Gwyn, and not only that, but the fading of the fire and the rise of the undead is as just as much a threat to Nito as it is to Gwyn. Lokey offers an interesting interpretation as to how Nito might have developed such a tool, and I quote Lokey now. The item's menu graphic portrays a single humanity curled over in apparent pain as it is burned by a bonfire's flame. By offering up humanity in this way, the flame grows, along with its healing properties, when its heat is extracted to Estus. Basically, this ceremony sacrifices a fragment of the Dark Soul to further fuel bonfires. If the soul is the origin of life, then its destruction would fall under the Gravelord's domain. Nito created a means to destroy the dark within man by drowning it in flame, having experience with creating and negating darkness with light. Again, I find this very compelling that the Lord of Death is the one that created a way in which you could destroy a fragment of the Dark Soul to empower the fire. Yet the Way of White are clearly also aware of this right, meaning that Nito must have shared it with them at one point, a point that Lokey makes. Yet now the Way of White are sending expeditions into Nito's domain to recover it. Perhaps it is because Pinwheel has taken possession of it for his own means, a rogue element, unlikely to work with the Way of White over his own selfish desires. The catacombs at this stage are no longer Nito's, it is now Pinwheel's domain, hostile territory, and with Nito essentially a recluse, these expeditions have become a dangerous necessity for the Way of White. With all these events and elements working against Nito, his power has very much faded, and when we face him in his tomb, we are able to strike down the shambling god of death, claiming his Lord Soul, and ending his dominion over the dead, at least in the immediate sense, as Nito's legacy does seem to carry on beyond his physical demise. By the time of Dark Souls 2, countless millennia have already passed, and the four lords are remembered in passing, but the world is no longer dominated by these gods. That being said, it is a sheer testament to the power of the Lord Souls that their legacy has shaped the institutions and civilizations of this later era. We see this in Hyde's Tower of Flame, clearly an offshoot from Anor Londo itself, that still emulates the beliefs and foundations of that society, but time and distance have changed it somewhat. Instead of the Blades of the Dark Moon, we now have the more simplified Blue Sentinels, clearly descended from the former, carrying out its mission, but forgetting its original master and reasons for it. One of my favourite details about the Tower of Hyde is an observation made by Lokey regarding the falcon-headed statues in this area. In his article on Hyde, which I will link below, Lokey points out that these statues are essentially Gwyn. It has just changed in presentation over time and lack of proximity. The statue strikes the same pose as the old statue of Gwyn found in Anor Londo, with his head being replaced by the head of a falcon, likely a reference to the sun god Ra in Lokey's opinion. Thus the statue has become a generalised sun god over time, rather than Gwyn specifically. Likewise, Nito's legacy seems not to have died with him, as he had acolytes beyond the pinwheels, who he appears to have taught his ways to. Firstly, we come to the Shrine of Amana, a peculiar location that lies in the depths below Drangleic Castle. The purpose of this shrine may not be immediately clear, but my speculation is that it's another attempt at confining the undead, for in this location we find the fascinating beings called the Nito, and as one can guess from their name, they are associated with the original Lord of Death, Nito. The Nito we speak to give us some insight into their origin and their role, as they say the following.
Nito, that is what we are called. My name? Do you mean our name? We know nothing of the outside world. We sing eternally for those who bear death and dark within themselves. We have been here forever. We know nothing of the outside world, and we do not need to. The little ones were born from the great dead one, and the great dead one taught us song. We have sung ever since, to comfort those bound by death and dark. This is what we were taught.
So we are straight up told that they were given this role by the Great Dead One, the term by which Nito is referred to in Dark Souls 2, again showing the generalisation of this deity, much like Gwyn became the sun god. The Nito also talk about the little ones who were born from the Great Dead One, meaning these creatures, or whatever they are creations of Nito himself. The Nito tell us that these little ones dance when the Nito sing. Now, it has long been my interpretation, of course many others, that the little ones are the golden sparkles that float above the head of the crawling undead found within the area. The reason I think so is because while these sparkles are present, the crawlers are passive. And the Nito told us that when the little ones dance, it gives comfort to those who have death and darkness within them. And so I think this is the pacifying effect of the little ones. They are dancing and providing comfort to these creatures. The reason I refer to these crawling creatures as undead is because of the way the Nito describe them, beings who carry death and darkness inside of them, clearly the undead or the hollows. Indeed, the entire shrine seems to be a place dedicated to nullifying hollowing, as further in there is another shrine, one with fire in the middle, seemingly dedicated to the Lord of Death, given its skeletal affectations and Nito attendant. The bonfire near this shrine is also called the Rise of the Dead, hammering home that this shrine is likely associated with Nito. The purpose of said altar is to reverse one's hollowing, perhaps channeling the power of death and the flame to do so. As we saw when we discussed the Rite of Kindling, it appears that Nito was able to use the fire to counteract the Dark Soul, burning it in the flame. What else is interesting is that in this area there are pyromancers, dressed in the garb of the Great Swamp, present around this burning shrine. But why are these pyromancers here? Are they defending it, or are they merely hollows who sought to utilise its power to reverse the undead curse? Both are real possibilities, though I do think it's more likely they are simply hollows who are drawn to its power and entranced by the song of the Nito. But let's consider the alternate possibility, that they have made a pact with the Nito to defend this area. Perhaps it is because they too worship the old pantheon, via the Mother of Chaos, the Witch of Izalith. As such, they too may wish to defend this shrine to the old pantheon. A pretty out there theory, but a valid one to consider. Regardless, the Shrine of Amana as a whole seems to fit in with what we know about Drangleic and its attempts to subvert the rise of the undead curse by Vendrick and Aldea. The Nito say they have been here forever, but whether this means literally in this spot forever or in the world seems moot, given it is in the land surrounding Drangleic Castle. It is more or less a certainty that the shrine's current infrastructure was created by Vendrick. No doubt Vendrick hoped to harness their dark calming powers against the rising dark, and this would explain why we find an imprisoned Nito in the tower of Drangleic Castle. Perhaps she was being interrogated, experimented upon. Whatever the purpose behind her imprisonment, I have no doubt it had something to do with their ability over the dark. Secondly, the Shrine of Amana actually acts as an excellent buffer or defense against the dark and undead, and this was a point made in a Reddit post by commenter Better Korea, who suggested that perhaps Vendrick saw the Nito as a way of keeping any creatures of dark out of the undead crypt, Nashandra included. And this is why he flees there, because he knows he has the Shrine of Amana as a buffer to escape from Nashandra. And as we'll discuss in a moment, the undead crypt also seems to be a place where the undead are lulled to slumber and contained. And again, perhaps the Shrine of Amana is another buffer to make sure no undead leave the crypt. Either way, it is fascinating that these beings, creatures taught by Nito himself, seem to be concerned with dealing with the dark. Of course, Nito's legacy continues right into the undead crypt, a further location that's purpose seems to be allowing the dead to rest, and as the name would suggest, containing the undead. We learn this from the overseer of the crypt himself, Gravewarden Agdane, who says the following to us as we enter the crypt.
I am Agdane, guardian of the crypt. Countless dead rest here in peace, cradled by the comfort of dark. Light only agitates. We have no need for it here. I am a finito. We weave death and watch over the dead. This task was granted to me by the one who gave us the first death. Countless souls rest here, some of them from ages long ago. Some were rich, others poor, some wise, some dull, but now they're all just dead.
So once again, the name of this particular race, and yes, it is a race because he refers to us as humans, tells us that these are a creation of Nito again, part of his legacy. For reference, the Finito are the blue-skinned beings that include Agdane and the other female priests who can be found near the entrance to the undead crypt, casting dark magics. He tells us how the dead can be potentially disturbed by light, and that the dark seems to comfort them. Earlier, we discussed the fact that Lokey tells us that death is really the death of the physical form, and that the spirit can exist and persist beyond this death. And while necromancy is a direct intervention to resurrect these spirits in other forms, even in dead bodies, as Nito and his followers do, it seems that spirits can persist after their bodies have died. And Lokey comments on this phenomena by talking about the enemies in New Londo, known as the Mass of Souls, and I quote Lokey now. New Londo's Mass of Souls enemy, more accurately a mountain of corpses, is an amalgamation of human bodies, which it twists into spears, or releases as the same wisps found in the catacombs. These wisps' internal name of Grudge implies that they persist due to resentment, hence their willingness to self-destruct to our detriment. They are found alongside the Cursed Ghost, whose designs evoke Yurei, Japanese spirits that remain bound to the earth due to grudges of their own. And so going back to the undead crypt, this is also most likely the case of the ghosts that we can find throughout the crypt. These are spirits whose bodies have died, but they persist for some reason, for some grudge. And perhaps, in part, these are the dead that Gravewarden Agdane hopes to give comfort to and rest to. However, the place is ultimately called the Undead Crypt, and as we venture further into the crypt, we do find undead enemies bursting out of the ground. Agdane mentions how the dead that are resting in the undead crypt are cradled by the comfort of the dark. This once again makes me think of what we saw in the Shrine of Amana, where these undead were comforted and pacified by the song of the Finito. Is it perhaps the same case in the undead crypt, that the power of the dark, overseen by the Finito, are somehow pacifying the undead found here, and this is essentially a containment centre for the undead? This is definitely my interpretation of the undead crypt, and it's a fascinating reflection on how intelligently Nito planned for the future when you think about it, and certainly lends greater perspective on his plans in his later years before he was slain by the chosen undead. Before we wrap up the video, we can't mention the fact that Nito taught his followers to use the dark or challenge it and not question it. How does Nito have such an understanding of the dark? For evidence of these followers of Nito using dark magic, look no further than the Finito priestesses that welcome you into the crypt with a volley of pursuer hexes. Followers of Nito literally wielding power derived from the dark soul. I'm sure many will look at Nito's domain over death and see how closely it cleaves to the dark. This is an unusual position for a god that aligned himself with Gwyn and the Witch, and Lokey does a great dissection of this unusual relationship, and I quote Lokey now. Nito holds a strange position in the Pantheon. The Gravelord servant's interference with and killing of others for prizes is reminiscent of the Darkwraith's invasions of other worlds to rob men of their humanity. Nito shrouds his domain in darkness, and his aura of death has a black core and white outline in-game, similar to humanity. Anor Londo's holy magic counters both agents of dark and the dead, negating necromancy. This is true even for Lloyd's talismans. Nito's power and the dark have a similar, perhaps complementary nature as powers of consequence. If disparity is mapped out on a spectrum, then light and life are closer to a state where fire is present, whereas dark and death are closer to the state where fire is absent. I think Lokey, as usual, cleaves right to the heart of the matter here. In a system of disparity and opposites, the life soul of Izalith and the light soul of Gwyn likely sit opposite the death soul of Nito and the dark soul of the Pygmy. Death and dark are two sides of the same coin, quiet, absent, passive, very much of the yin side, alongside dark in a yin and yang concept of universe and balance. Yet unlike the dark, death cannot exist without its counterbalance. The dark can consume all and be left as the only thing standing, but if the dark brings oblivion, then Nito will have no life it can bring death to. This explains Nito's close relationship to the dark, but also explains his resistance to it. It is an interesting relationship, and it likely explains why Nito is more apt in using the dark for his own aims. He understands it better and is ultimately closer to it in nature. This closeness could be further signified by the fact that two dark-related items can be made from the old Dead One's soul in Dark Souls 2, a hex called Numbness and the Crypt Blacksword. The Numbness hex in particular is interesting, as its description seems to suggest that it uses the power of the dark to numb one's existence, perhaps in the same manner that the dark is used in the Undead Crypt to lull the undead to slumber. A fascinating indicator of how close Nito really was to the dark, and how his soul is closer than any to the dark soul. This is ultimately the same god who ruled over a light-devouring domain of death, the Tomb of the Giants, which has an unnatural darkness to it. Indeed, Lokey also highlights the fact that the darkness within the Tomb of the Giants is not natural, and is clearly the work of the Gravelord's power. Lokey's translation of the Skull Lantern, lanterns used by the necromancers in the catacombs, indicates that Nito's domain devours ordinary light, which is why these magical lanterns are needed by his servants to navigate this dark domain. With Agdane's comments about the dead resting in the dark in mind, it's hard not to look back at the Tomb of the Giants retrospectively from Dark Souls 2 and think that Nito made this domain dark not only to make it a more dangerous place for his enemies, but to help the dead rest. Again, I do think Dark Souls 2 does add some interesting retrospective elements to Nito's story. It makes us realise how powerful Nito's soul truly was. Of course, Nito's legacy persists in a more direct way than the Finito or Finito, in the form of the Rotten. The Rotten is the newest inheritor of the Lord of Death soul, given it drops the old Dead One's soul in New Game Plus. It becomes apparent that while the Rotten is not the Lord of Death reborn, some habits and elements of Nito's personality clearly comes through with certain behaviours. Firstly, the Rotten finds himself in the bowels of the earth, as if it is instinctive for this particular soul to seek out a domain that is similar to its original one. Of course, the Rotten also wields a singular large blade in its right hand, just like Nito did. Again, perhaps a force of habit from this soul. And the form of the Rotten itself is also very similar to Gravelord Nito. However, instead of being a construct of skeletons, this is a construct of flesh, perhaps using a remnant of Nito's necromantic powers to create this body. And finally, the Rotten seems to be the guardian for lost things, as its soul reads the following. Soul of the Rotten, who writhes deep within the gutter. The Rotten embraces all, in his sanctuary, for all things rotten or tossed away. Much as Nito was once the guardian for the dead, watching over them, the Rotten is now the guardian of all things forgotten or rotten. One of my favourite passages from Lokey's chapter on Nito is the following, where he comments on Nito's penchant for necromancy and creating his skeletal and necromantic servants. We skipped over the design of the pinwheel, as I wanted to discuss it here at the close of the video. It of course takes the form of a family, child, mother and father all combined. But why? I remember in the early days of Dark Souls lore, right at the beginning, there were some that theorised that this was a personal story, that the pinwheel boss was trying to use Nito's power to undo this and bring back his family. However, this of course makes no sense, given there are numerous pinwheels, so there must be some logic or reason behind making the servants this way. Lokey's interpretation of their makeup is as follows. This may reflect on their master, as Nito is the only medial lord with no intimate partner or surviving relatives. If the god was celibate in life, then his embrace of death and focus on spreading it to others may double as a means for him to cope with the solitude. He was alone, in the unfair chaos of life, but now they are all part of the equalizing harmonious family of death. The Gravelord's servants are kenzoku, which also refers to one's kin or household, and is commonly employed for the familiars and turned servants of vampires, among others. I find this really compelling, especially when you consider the kanji used for the Gravelord's servants, denoting them as part of his household, rather than his slaves or priests. Perhaps this desire for family is what is coming through with the Rotten as well. We can see he welcomes all the undesired of the above world, including these unusual statues that inhabit the gulch. This is something so meaningful to him that it causes him to go into an unfettered rage when one of these statues breaks. I think this definitely thematically fits with what we know about Nito. He is ultimately a guardian watching over his flock. And I think this is personally one of the most warming aspects of the Gravelord. It was his need for family or belonging that persisted into his new form beyond anything else. While he's not the Lord of Death, he is still a being that watches over a new flock that would be largely vilified on the surface world. So thanks guys, that is my take on the Gravelord, Death and his legacy. Once again, a massive shout out to Lokey and his Abyssal Archive. If you do want to grab the archive for yourself, either digital or hard copy, feel free to follow my affiliate link in the description below. This is certainly a subject that requires a lot of speculation and interpretation, as there's a lot of gaps to fill in. And so now it's your turn to take to the comments and give me your thoughts on Nito and his followers, where you disagree or where you agree with me. But until next time guys, I will see you in the Tomb of the Giants. Take care, watch your step, and have a wonderful evening.